Professor Nwaomah, COVID-19 has perplexed all of us. People are locked down. They wonder, how long will it be? But many of us also want to ask the Bible. They want to know. And you and I would wish to know whether the Bible has some prophetic insight about the pandemics, of course, because I think that COVID is one of many other pandemics. But specifically, please tell us, how do you situate this pandemic in the biblical prophecy?
Okay, thank you, Elder Prince, for the question. I think I do agree with you that people are seeking answers today, especially from the scriptures. And when you listen to what is happening outside here, there are several interpretations. Just as you mentioned, we begin from the context that COVID-19 is indeed a pandemic, and of course a pestilence. And in that context now, we would understand that pestilence is a regular word in the scriptures. And we would want to look at its occurrences. For example, in biblical history, looking at the Old Testament, pestilence, wars, and famine are the three instruments that God most times used to recall his people from rebellion whenever they went astray. And these instruments were instruments of love. For example, we will look at Leviticus 26, 21 to 25, Jeremiah 21, 6 to 9, Jeremiah 24, 10, Ezekiel 7, 15, and then Ezekiel 14, 12 to 21. So when Israel was unfaithful, God normally used these three instruments in order to bring them back to himself. But when we move to the New Testament, we also see that the word pestilence occurs in Scripture. Of course, in Matthew 21:11, depending on the English version you are using, you will read pestilence. Some actually even translate as pandemic. Luke 21:11. But it's important to know that Luke mentions pestilence and also earthquakes and famines here as part of the events that would occur prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. But let it also be important to note here that when we look at Luke 21, 25 to 28, the word pestilence does not occur in that section which deals more with the second coming of Christ. And so first we will say that when we read Luke chapter 21 verse 11, pestilence occurs in the context of the fall of Jerusalem. And we will say now it is more or less a historical event. But we can move a little further. Revelation chapter 6 verse 8. The Bible mentions pestilence, of course, death, and also famine. However, it's also important to note that in the context of Revelation chapter 6 verse 8, death, famine, and pestilence in this context are now historical in the sense that they are behind us. They are the events that occurred several years back. And now that brings us to a third passage. There are several of them, but we'll just deal with three of them this morning. Revelation chapter 15 verse 1, which describes the 7 last plagues. And these last plagues here, if I would want to read quickly here, the author said, "Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and amazing, 7 angels with 7 plagues, which are the last, for with them the wrath of God is finished." Now, in this context, it seems that during the time of the end, certain pandemics will be inflicted on the wicked prior to the second coming of Christ. However, the question is, are we now just close to the second coming of Christ? Of course.
Or is this a punishment?
Exactly. And that's where I'm going to.
Sure.
And you know, that is where many people have been going on today. Many people have been talking about that today. But in this context, let us really understand here that these are the 7 last plagues. And we could consider, of course, pandemic, pestilence as one of the plagues that will be poured on the wicked, the wrath of God on the wicked. So in this context, therefore, even though certain pandemics will occur at the end of time, I think it is a bit sensational and a cause for caution to conclude that COVID-19 is the rough or is one of the pandemics or the pestilence on the wicked, on the wicked. Because after all, both Christians and non-Christians today suffer from pandemics. The death ratio we have had, over 200,000, they are all Christians. Amongst them too, of course, we know there are those who do not believe in God, but we do believe there are many of them who are Christians. So it will be a bit sensational and I think irrational to judge and conclude immediately that COVID-19 is the pestilence or form the pestilence or one of the pestilence of the last days, because in this case, it falls both on the Christians and the Christians. Of course, the Bible speaks about pestilence, and I think it's very important to understand the occurrences in context.
Yeah.
I see.
At
in
least
context.
I can glean from
Yeah.
your explanation that
Yeah.
this is a pestilence.
It's a
right?
pestilence.
Yes, but if it is not now the wrath of God
Yes.
on the wicked,
Yes.
on the wicked,
Yes.
what is it now?
Good. That is good. And I think that brings me to three very important points I want to make. The first point is that, human disobedience manifested in various activities that are outside the plan and purposes of God definitely will fracture the environment. Ethical issues are there, which of course some of them are anti the plan of God. And this human disobedience manifested in some of these ways definitely fracturing the environment can cause pestilence and pandemic. Of course, we know there's the debate whether it came from a lab, whether it didn't come from a lab, but all these things are the result of the human activities that are outside even the plans and purposes of God. Now, the second point I want to make is when you look at Romans chapter 8, verses 19 to 22, this is just one of the passages. In context, Paul here speaks about suffering. And Paul here makes clear that even our world today is already decaying. And because it's decaying, it is already experiencing and even presenting the evidences of decay.
And if it was decayed during the time of Paul,
Yeah, how much now?
Today?
You see, how much now? And experiencing the evidence of decay, because Paul even says is held in bondage. And when Paul speaks of bondage here, he refers back to Genesis chapter 3, of course, which of course caused what is the earth. And like you have mentioned here, if it was decaying in Paul's time, how much more will it be? So if we look at Paul, therefore, with the color of Paul, this decay caused by sin is capable of fracturing the environment. And this definitely can also lead to pandemic. And so it is a bit sensational to try to interpret every pandemic and every pestilence, even like COVID-19, as a sign of the end, because we should also need to know that the effects of sin is also there. And fourth, like I mentioned earlier on, that it is very obvious that our world is approaching a renewal. We're already a decay. The third last point I want to make here is that rather than Christians today attempting to fit every pandemic into end-time prophecy and then regarding them as God's judgment, because we are not yet, even as Christians, Seventh-day Christians, we are not yet, though we cannot give a schedule for God's event, divine event, but we know that if we look at chapter 15, verse 1 of Revelation, which is very clear that that will be the last plague, it is difficult to say that we're exactly at that moment now. And even if we're at the moment now, then the Bible also says that this is going to be the wrath of God on the weekend. But the pandemic is not only on the weekend. So rather than sensationalizing COVID-19 as a divine wrath, so to say, on the weekend, I think that we need to realize that we are called to faithfulness. And what is that faithfulness? That faithfulness is proclaiming the love of God. Amen. It's proclaiming the love of God. And we are also called to faithfulness. And that faithfulness is to pray for the renewal of God's creation. Amen. By His coming. Because we know as we near the end of time, many of such pandemics would come. Many of such pandemics will come. And I think that is where I would like to conclude.
Thank you, Professor Nwaomah, for situating this pandemic among many others. In fact, before COVID-19, we saw the conflagration in Australia, locusts everywhere, but people are only focusing on COVID-19, of course, because it is a pandemic. It is, striking the whole world. Now, just one word, a takeaway from our dear viewer before you leave us. Yeah,
the takeaway I would like to give to our viewers is, just as I mentioned on some of the concluding points here, is to know that our world is already exhibiting seriously the evidences of decay. And this evidence of a decay can fracture the environment, can cause unethical decisions and behavior, can definitely bring so many unexplainable activities, some of which are pandemics, some of which are pestilences. And so, as Christians, we need to sincerely pray for the renewal of God's creation, which will be ushered in by the second coming of Christ. And in doing so, we prepare ourselves and prepare others also, so that we can experience that new world where there will be no pandemics, where we will not fear, like in 1918, our grandparents suffered, we suffered it now, that our children again in the future may suffer such a thing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Amen.
Amen.